The day my mother's will was read, everyone in that room already knew how the story was going to end. My brother had made sure of that. He'd spent the drive over telling his wife, loud enough for me to hear from the back seat, that Dad's old property up in the Okanagan was basically worthless. Overgrown land and a cabin that hasn't been updated since 1987, he said. She's welcome to it. He laughed a little. His wife laughed too. I looked out the window and said nothing. My mother passed away in March, 2 weeks after her 79th birthday. She died in her own bed, in the house she'd lived in for 31 years, with her cat on the blanket beside her and me holding her hand. That's how she wanted it. She'd told me so, many times. My brother had visited 4 times in the last 3 years, I counted. Because I was the one who noticed when he didn't come. I should probably explain how we got here. My brother, I'll call him by what he's always been to me, which is simply my older brother, 6 years ahead of me, always 6 years ahead of me in everything, built a career that our whole extended family talked about at every gathering. He co-founded a mid-sized logistics company in Calgary. By the time our mother got sick, it was doing well enough that he had people running most of it for him. He had a house in Springbank, a ski chalet he and his wife used maybe 4 weekends a year, and the kind of casual confidence that comes from never really having to worry about money. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked at the same hospital in Kelowna for 11 years. It's meaningful work. I love it. It does not make me wealthy, and I never expected it to. When our mother was first diagnosed with the early stages of vascular dementia, I was the one who happened to live 40 minutes away. My brother was a 6-hour flight. We both agreed, or rather, I agreed, and he seemed relieved, that I would take the lead on her care. At first, that just meant checking in more often, helping manage her medications, going with her to appointments. Over the next 4 years, it became my second life. I reduced my hours at the hospital when she could no longer drive. I hired a part-time caregiver to come in on mornings I worked, and I paid for a portion of that myself when the provincial home care allocation ran short. I learned more about the BC healthcare system than I ever expected to, because navigating it on her behalf became something close to a part-time job. I handled her banking after she started losing track of which bills had been paid. I repaired the fence in her backyard so her dog wouldn't get out. I sat with her through a hospitalization in the winter of 2023 when she had a small stroke, and for 3 days we weren't sure what we were going to come back with. My brother flew out for that one. He stayed 4 days, brought flowers, cried in the hallway, and then flew home. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it's what happened. He called every week or two. The calls were warm and genuine, I think. He asked how she was doing. He sent money a few times when I mentioned a specific need, and I was grateful for that. But the calls always ended the same way, with relief in his voice, knowing that things were being handled. I was the one handling them. My mother and I talked about a lot of things in those last years, in the way you do when someone is slowly losing the present, but can still reach the past clearly. She talked about her own mother, about the early years of her marriage, about the summer she spent in Prince Edward Island as a young woman. She talked about us, my brother and me, with equal love and no apparent hierarchy. She was not a woman who showed favoritism. She was not a woman who talked about money. But once, about 8 months before she died, on a Tuesday afternoon, when we were sitting at her kitchen table, and I was helping her sort through some old documents she'd decided needed organizing, she looked up at me and said, "You know I see what you do, every day." I told her she didn't have to say that, she said. "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm saying it." I didn't think much more about it at the time. She said things like that occasionally. I assumed it was just her way of expressing love, which she'd always done more through words than grand gestures. When she passed, the grief was quieter than I expected. Not smaller, just quieter. The kind that sits with you instead of crashing over you, because you've been bracing for it for so long that your whole body already knows the shape of it. I'd spent 4 years slowly letting go. By the end, I was mostly just grateful she hadn't suffered, and that she'd known where she was, and who I was, up until the last few weeks. The funeral was held in Kelowna. My brother gave the eulogy. He did it well. He's always been the better speaker, and he cried, and it was real, and I held no resentment about any of it. She was his mother too, His grief was real too. Afterward, relatives I hadn't seen in years gathered at her house. My aunt on my mother's side whispered to my cousin that it was a shame the house would have to be sold. My cousin nodded like this was already settled. I stood near the kitchen and listened to people eat sandwiches and talk about what would happen to everything. The way people do at these gatherings, like grief and logistics, naturally belong in the same afternoon. My brother seemed relaxed. He'd already mentioned to me, twice, that he had a contact at a real estate firm in the city who could handle the property listings. Plural. He'd said listings, assuming there was more than one property to deal with, though as far as either of us knew at that point, there was only the house. A week later, we sat in the office of my mother's solicitor, a composed woman named Miss Okafor, who had been handling my mother's affairs for over a decade. The office was downtown, 7th floor, with a view of Okanagan Lake that my mother would have loved. My brother arrived 5 minutes late with coffee. He offered me some. I declined. There were a few other people present, my aunt, my mother's oldest friend, a cousin who had been named in a smaller bequest. But the main portion of the estate, as everyone assumed, would come down to my brother and me. Miss Okafor was efficient and calm. She explained the structure of the will clearly, moving through each item without dramatizing anything. My mother's house, the one in Kelowna, the one I'd been in and out of 1,000 times over 4 years, would go to my brother, along with its contents and any proceeds from its eventual sale. The house was worth somewhere between $800,000 and just over $1 million in the current market, depending on the assessment. It was, by any measure, the obvious centerpiece of the estate. My brother nodded. He had the expression of someone who'd been waiting politely for something they already knew was coming. Then Miss Okafor continued. The secondary property, the old cabin and land in the South Okanagan, near Oliver, would pass to me. My brother exhaled through his nose, not rudely, but with the unmistakable sound of someone confirming a low expectation. The Oliver property, he said. It wasn't a question. Miss Okafor glanced up briefly, then continued reading. My brother turned to me. He kept his voice quiet, but not quiet enough. That place hasn't been touched in years, he said. You know it'll cost money just to deal with it, right? The access road alone. He shook his head. I hope she didn't think she was doing you a favor. The room wasn't large. Everyone heard. My aunt looked at her hands. My mother's friend looked out at the lake. My brother seemed to realize he'd miscalculated the volume, but not enough to walk it back. He just settled into his chair and reached for his coffee. I felt the familiar sensation of being 17 years old at a dinner table, being talked past. The sensation passed quickly. I am not 17 anymore. Miss Okafor waited a moment. Then she said, in the same measured tone she'd used for everything else. There is an additional matter your mother asked me to address after the primary distribution was announced. My brother looked up. Additional matter? Yes. She reached into a separate folder, thinner than the main documents, with a slightly different color tab. Your mother left a letter. She was quite specific that it be read aloud, in this room, at this point in the meeting. My brother said nothing. For the first time since we'd arrived, he put down his coffee. Ms. Okafor unfolded 3 handwritten pages. My mother had neat, careful handwriting, the kind that came from a generation that was taught penmanship in school and took it seriously. Dear family, Ms. Okafor began, if you're hearing this, then I've had time to say everything I needed to say in life, and I'm trusting that it was enough. There are only a few things I want to add here. The room had gone very still. I want to say clearly that I love both of my children. I have loved them differently at different times, in the ways that life required, and I have no regrets about either of them. I am proud of the man my son became, the company he built, the life he made. These are real accomplishments, and I told him so when I could. My brother's expression shifted slightly. Something behind his eyes softened, just briefly. Then Miss Okafor turned the page. But I also want to say something that I was not always good at saying out loud. For the last 4 years of my life, one person showed up. Not because she was nearby, not because it was convenient, but because she decided that's what we were going to do. She and she never complained about it once, not to me. I pressed my lips together. The fluorescent light above was doing something strange to the room. She gave up shifts. She gave up weekends. She sat in waiting rooms and argued with insurance representatives, and drove me to appointments I didn't want to go to, and she held my hand. And she talked to me when I couldn't always follow what she was saying. And it didn't seem to matter to her that I couldn't always follow. She stayed anyway. My aunt was crying quietly. I hadn't noticed when that started. The Oliver property is not the lesser inheritance. I need you to understand that. Mrs. Okafor paused slightly, as if giving the room a moment to adjust to what was coming. 12 years ago, I quietly retained mineral and surface rights on a portion of that land when the original estate was restructured after your father passed. I said nothing about it at the time because it seemed like a legal formality more than anything else. But 3 years ago, I was approached by a renewable energy development company regarding a long-term land lease for a solar installation on the south-facing section of the property. I engaged a consultant. I reviewed the proposal. I made a decision. My brother sat forward. Ms. Okafor continued reading. The agreement was finalized 14 months ago. The lease term is 40 years, with 2 renewal options. The projected income over the initial term, based on the figures in the attached schedule, exceeds the current assessed value of the Kelowna house by a considerable margin. The land itself is not encumbered by any debt. It carries no obligations beyond the lease terms, which are favorable. The room did not explode the way rooms do in movies. It went quieter somehow. My cousin made a small sound. My aunt had stopped crying and was now staring at the table. My brother said, "How much?" Mrs. Okafor looked at him directly and stated a number. A figure per year, over 40 years, with indexing provisions. I won't repeat the number here. What I will say is that my brother's company, which I knew to be doing reasonably well, was worth somewhere in the range of that total figure. Possibly less, depending on the year. That can't be right, my brother said. His voice was different now. Quieter. Something had gone out of it. It is correct, Ms. Okafor said. She slid a document across the table. Then she slid another one. You'll also want to note, regarding the Kelowna property, your mother carried a home equity line of credit that was drawn on in 2021 to cover some care-related expenses and a significant roof repair. The outstanding balance will need to be resolved from the sale proceeds. The net, after that, will be somewhat lower than the assessed value suggests. My brother picked up the papers. He read. He kept reading. His wife, who had come with him and was sitting slightly behind him, put her hand on his arm. He didn't seem to notice. Ms. Okafor returned to the letter. I am not doing this to punish anyone, she read. I want to say that clearly. I am doing this because I believe in keeping promises, even the silent ones. My daughter never asked me what she would receive. She only ever asked me what I needed. That is the only thing I want to be remembered for in this room today, that I noticed. That I understood the difference between people who show up and people who mean to. She turned to the last page. The Oliver property came into our family before either of you were born. Your grandfather planted the first trees on that land. I have always believed that the land should go to whoever would understand what it means to tend something quietly, without recognition, for a long time. I think you both know who that is. Miss Okafor folded the pages. She placed them on the table in front of me. The room was silent. My brother was still looking at the financial documents. I don't know exactly what he was thinking. I know that the expression on his face was not the one he'd walked in with. After a long moment, he looked up. He didn't look at me. He looked somewhere past me, toward the window, toward the lake. Did you know? He asked. His voice was level but only just. About the lease, I said. No. He nodded once. He looked back down at the papers. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. Some part of me had spent so many years not expecting to be seen that the experience of it, even posthumously, even through a lawyer's reading voice, was almost disorienting. I sat with it. I let it settle. My aunt reached over and squeezed my hand without saying anything. My mother's friend, who had known her for over 50 years, who had watched her raise 2 children after my father died young, who had sat with her through difficult seasons that neither of my brother nor I fully knew about, looked at me across the table and smiled in a way that held entire decades in it. We left the office separately. My brother and his wife took the elevator. I took the stairs, which I do sometimes when I need to think. Outside, the afternoon was one of those bright, sharp Okanagan days where everything looks like it's been cleaned. The lake was flat. The hills across it were brown and dry in the way they get in late spring. I sat in my car for a while before starting it. I thought about the Tuesday afternoon at my mother's kitchen table. The old document spread out between us. The way she'd looked up at me and said what she said, I'd assumed it was just her way of expressing love. It was also, I understand now, a kind of reassurance. She was telling me that she'd already decided, that I didn't need to worry, that she had been paying attention the whole time, even in the years when her memory for other things was starting to soften and blur. She'd been carrying this plan quietly for over a decade. She'd engaged lawyers, consulted financial advisors, negotiated a 40-year land lease, and said nothing. Not to me, not to my brother, not apparently to anyone except the people whose job it was to execute it. That level of quiet deliberateness was so thoroughly, recognizably her, that I almost laughed sitting there in the parking garage, alone, with the fluorescent light flickering above the concrete. She'd kept the secret the way she'd done everything. Steadily, without making a production of it, trusting that the right moment would come. The months that followed were not simple. The Kelowna house took longer to sell than expected. The equity line complicated things. My brother and I had a difficult phone call in June, one that covered a lot of ground we'd probably both been avoiding for years. It wasn't a pleasant conversation, but it was an honest one. And by the end of it, I think we'd said some things that needed to be said. We're still in contact. We'll probably always be in contact, in the way that adult siblings are. Complicated, occasional, real. I've been out to the Oliver property twice since the estate was settled. The first time to walk it properly, and meet with the development company's site manager, a practical woman who explained the installation timeline and what the land would look like once construction was complete. The second time, I just went alone, on a Saturday in early September, with coffee in a thermos and no particular plan. My grandfather's trees are still there, along the north side of the property. Old ponderosa pines. They don't have anything to do with the solar installation. They're well outside the development footprint, but they're still standing, which felt important to confirm. I sat under one of them for a while. The valley below was still and warm, the kind of afternoon that makes you understand why people choose to stay in a place. My mother was right. The Oliver land was never the lesser thing. It just required someone who understood that value and loudness are not the same, that some things accumulate quietly over years without announcing themselves, until the moment arrives when they do. She understood that about land. She understood it about people. I think sitting there under those pines, that's the thing I most want to carry forward. Not the lease, not the income, though I won't pretend that isn't meaningful and real, and a kind of security I've never had before. But the understanding itself, that showing up, consistently, without applause, for something or someone that matters, is never wasted. She saw it. She always had. That's the inheritance that matters most.